I'm really happy to have our guest today back on Point of Inquiry. He's considered the founder of the field of modern bioethics. The New Yorker calls him the world's most influential living philosopher, and Time magazine listed him in the Time 100, which is their annual listing of the world's 100 most influential people. That's not to say everyone loves him. Social Justice Review called him the architect of the culture of death, and many think his moral reasonings to be very similar to Nazi justifications that some life is not worthy of life. Still, his arguments are persuasive to many of us. He's DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University and laureate professor at the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the University of Melbourne. He's a humanist laureate of the International Academy of Humanism and also a founding member of the Great Ape Project, which is trying to get the United Nations to adopt a declaration on great apes that would award them the legal status of personhood. He writes a regular column for Free Inquiry magazine and is the author of dozens of books, including Practical Ethics, Rethinking Life and Death, and Animal Liberation, which has sold more than 500,000 copies. Welcome back to Point of Inquiry, Peter Singer.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be with you.
Time magazine, Professor, called you the most influential philosopher in the world. Many of your peers consider you one of the most important ethicists working today. You pretty much started the worldwide animal rights movement. Your arguments on abortion, on euthanasia, kind of rebooted the thinking in those fields. But the paradox to me is that the majority of people who would run across your arguments for the first time would find that the positions you propose are the exact opposite of what most people consider to be ethical or moral. Here's the question. Do you think that's just because most people are much more unethical or inconsistent in their ethics than you are?
Well, firstly, let me say I think that statement is a little too sweeping. I think that in some of the areas that I've written about, for instance, about our obligations to help the world's poorest people, many people would say that what I'm saying is ethical. Some people would say it's too demanding, but I don't think anybody would think that it's the opposite of what we ethically ought to do. You're probably referring to some of my views about euthanasia, abortion, even infanticide. So on those sorts of issues, there are certainly some people who would think my views are the opposite of what's ethical. And I think that's really because people don't think very clearly on these issues, because they actually just accept a conventional morality without having really tried to work through what our moral judgments are and should be based on.
And that traditional morality kind of handed down to them is the opposite of your whole project, which is really exploring what an ethical system would look like if you took the naturalistic view of the universe seriously, if you took Darwin seriously. The view that there is no God who gives us our morality, there is no evidence for the supernatural realm, there's just us and other animals, and we all evolved from common origins, common shared ancestors. What would an ethics look like if it took all of this into account? That's your project, and for you, such an ethics wouldn't really give the human species a special place in it all. It would, in fact, include many non-human animals in the category of things we should be ethically considering.
Certainly, if we're not taking a religious perspective, then we can't just assume that humans alone were made in the image of God, because we don't think there is a God at all. We don't think humans were made, for that matter. We think that we've evolved from other species. We also have no reason to believe that humans alone have an immortal soul, or that indeed anyone has an immortal soul. And thirdly, we certainly would not believe that God gave us dominion over the animals, and many Christians have interpreted that to mean that we can do as we please with the animals. So all of those things have to go out of the window, and that means we just have to look at our situation and say, well, here we are, we're on this planet, we have evolved from other beings. There are other beings on this planet who are like us, sentient beings, that is, they're capable of feeling pleasure and pain. And how ought we to be living among those beings? How ought we to be acting among ourselves with other human beings? And how ought we to be acting with other species? Those are the sorts of questions that we need to ask then.
On some of these big ethical issues, not all of them, as you mentioned, not poverty issues, etc., but say cloning, stem cell research, abortion, euthanasia, animal rights, on these issues, you're pushing a view that's the exact opposite extreme as, say, a Bible-believing Christian. In fact, in that community, you're like public enemy number one. You're considered the most radical challenge out there to Christian ethics. Does that mean, Peter, that you think that if you believe in the Bible, if you're a Bible-believing Christian, it's going to be harder for you to be moral? Or maybe put it another way, that only by basing your ethics in a naturalistic view of the world, informed, say, by Darwin's theory of evolution, can we arrive at the right place when it comes to the issues I just mentioned? In other words, religious ethics and your natural ethics don't really seem to be compatible one iota.
I think that there are some areas where they're compatible. I think really if you take the teachings of Jesus Christ as presented in the Gospels as, your model to learn from, for instance, you would have to follow all these things about how, the rich man should give away everything that he has. It's as hard for a rich man to go to heaven as for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. There's lots of sayings in the Bible about how we should be helping the poor, those who are hungry, we should give food, and those who are thirsty, we should give to drink, and so on. All of which, in a way, I think are quite noble and right. I think the problem is just that Christians basically don't do them. They hang on to their wealth, and they somehow hope that they'll get to heaven despite having all that riches. I don't really quite understand how they combine that, but they do. So on those issues, we have some parallels.
On poverty issues, but on stem cell research, cloning, euthanasia, end-of-life questions.
I mean, again, is there a biblical position on cloning and stem cell research? Even I don't see it. I mean, I can't see anything in the Bible that tells you how you ought to think about those questions. Now, it's true that many people who call themselves evangelical Christians would say that it's wrong to destroy embryos in order to obtain stem cells. But there's nothing I can see in the Bible that justifies that belief. There's not even really anything about abortion. I mean, if you go back to the Hebrew writings, then you would say that, well, maybe, yes, there's something about people who cause another woman to miscarry have to pay a penalty, but of course, that's understandable because most women who are pregnant want to have their child, and so you're harming the child. There's nothing that I can see really specifically against abortion. In Scripture. So I think it's not so much that I'm against Scriptures, that rather I'm against the way in which the Christian tradition has very often gone without, as far as I can see, much basis in the writings that they regard as sacred.